Welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs conference call series. My name is Dennis Hoover, Vice President for Research and Publications at IGE, and I'll serve as the moderator on today's call. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, Professor of Conflict Resolution at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Dr. Prodromou has recently returned from Greece, where she participated in the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, the first time since the 9th century that all of the autocephalous Orthodox churches from all over the world have met in council. She was a member of the delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople and was one of only a few women to participate in the council. Dr. Prodromou will be sharing her reflections on the council that matters for the future of global religion and global change. Dr. Prodromou is a widely cited authority on religion and politics, especially in the area of Eastern Orthodox Christianity and politics. In addition to her position at Tufts University, she is also an affiliate scholar at Harvard University's Center for European Studies and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington. She has served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and on the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. She recently served as a guest editor on a special issue of IGE's journal, The Review of Faith and National Affairs, which examined orthodoxy and humanitarianism. Now, before I turn the mic over to Elizabeth, just a few quick words on today's call format. We'll begin with about 20 minutes of remarks from Dr. Prodromou, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. If you'd like to ask Dr. Prodromou a question, please press 5* at any point during the call, and you'll be placed in the queue. Please also note that this call is on the record, and an audio recording will be made available on the IGE website. So with that introduction, let's turn now to our call. Thanks again, Elizabeth, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be with you today on the call. I thought what I would do is start out by giving some background to the Holy and Great Council, as it's called, the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Churches, or a Pan-Orthodox Council. Maybe give a little bit of background to the council, talk a little bit about the agenda items, and then turn to some of the internal dynamics of the council and also its deliverables, all the while trying to keep us focused on why this matters, why this event even matters for scholar practitioners who work on religion and global affairs, and also highlight some of the points that you mentioned in the introduction about my participation in there and what it tells us about the Council and the Orthodox Church more generally. So let me say a little bit about these things, and then we can move forward to Q&A. By way of background, it's worth pointing out that this council, which was the first meeting of all of the autocephalous Orthodox churches since the 9th century, actually constituted in some ways, I would say, a tipping point for the church. It was an effort for the church to really come to terms, examine, make sense of the fact that what was a church that began in a very particular set of geographic circumstances, historical circumstances, an old world church, as it were, has evolved over time to become a global transnational church. And in this regard, the real, I would say, takeaway from this council is that it was an experience in maturation. And I'll come back to that later on as I move forward. Just by way of background for the council, the preparations for this event actually began in the early part of the 20th century, and that was when the Ecumenical Patriarch, then Joachim, actually issued an encyclical that focused on the challenges that Orthodox churches were confronting at the time. And here again, we're still mainly talking about old world churches, and the main challenges confronting them at the time really dealt with what were broad geopolitical changes, namely the emergence of nation states in Europe and the Middle East, and what had really been the Orthodox heartland, if you were. So coming to terms with and unfortunately the violent geopolitics that surrounded these churches emerging as autocephalous churches, and what we would call, I would say, the territorialization of Orthodox churches along the nation-state model. After that encyclical, World War War I intervenes, and it wasn't until the 1930s that an inter-Orthodox preparatory committee was actually convened on Mount Athos in Greece. And at that preparatory committee, 17 agenda items were laid out, or 17 agenda topics, I should say, were laid out. This council actually dealt with 6, so we've seen a steady kind of compression of the items on the agenda. Again, geopolitics intervened, namely World War II, so there was little progress on a Pan-Orthodox meeting and agenda. It wasn't until the 1950s that the then ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras, who was a really kind of towering figure as a leader in Orthodox globalization and Orthodox maturation, I would say, he issued 2 letters in 1951 and 52 to all the primates or the archbishops and patriarchs of the autocephalous churches, again calling for the move towards a Pan-Orthodox council. And in 1961, there was a meeting of Orthodox primates, and they reduced the agenda items to 8 categories. We then see over the next decade and a half a succession of meetings, what we came to call Pan-Orthodox preconciliar conferences, that reduced these agenda items to 10. And finally ended up with the final agenda items of 6 that were dealt with in Crete. And just to put out what those items were in Crete, the items were fasting, marriage, autonomy, the question of how churches declare or are granted autonomy, diaspora, the relationship of the Orthodox Church with other Christians, and then, or what I would call ecumenism, and then the 6th agenda item was the mission of the Orthodox Church in today's world. And I would call that interfaith, ecumenism, and global transformation, but that's clearly my appellation. So this is the backdrop. We're talking about nearly a century of meetings for this council that happened in the first 2 weeks of June. Actually, we met on Pentecost, the Pentecost holiday in June, and met for a full week. So met for 1 week in June in Crete. The real kind of heavy lifting, what I would call the heavy, intense lifting for this council, occurred over the last 10 years, with, again, a series of accelerated preconciliar conferences and meetings attended by representatives and ultimately then heads of the Orthodox autocephalous churches. And when I say heavy lifting, because it was really in these last 10 years, and in particular in the last 3 to 5 years, that these meetings agreed upon the 6 agenda items that I mentioned, and also addressed one of the kind of procedural questions that ultimately came to be a point of contention in the council itself, and that was address the issue of the meaning of consensus, whether or not consensus within the context of a great and holy council would mean unanimity or whether it would mean majority. And this question itself, as far as I'm concerned from a procedural point of view, ultimately came to embody and reflect a larger conversation about how it is that the church itself maintained a kind of faithfulness to its canonical traditions, but also accepted those traditions as malleable and adaptable. So the agenda items were finally agreed upon by using the principle of unanimity as a definition for consensus. And again, speaking from a more of a kind of political science perspective and a policy perspective, ultimately, that approach to the agenda items was, from my perspective, a way to get all of the 14 Orthodox primates on board, getting everybody across the finish line so that the council itself would actually happen. And what ultimately transpired against this backdrop is that the council met in Crete. It was initially intended to meet in Constantinople at the Church of Constantinople or Istanbul. There was a decision made in January of 2016, only a few months before the council was about to take place, to relocate the council to Crete. And this was, again, an example from my perspective of geopolitics, or the geopolitics, framing the process of the council itself. The decision was taken because of the declining security environment, the deteriorating security environment in Turkey, with a series of terrorist attacks in Istanbul and more broadly in Turkey, but also was a reflection of the rupture between the Republic of Turkey and Russia, and the Church of Moscow, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Patriarchate of Moscow, feeling concerned about their vulnerability traveling to Turkey in that kind of a context. Again, this is a social scientist, perspective on this, but nonetheless, the council was relocated then to Crete. What happened then? The council itself addressed these agenda items, but before the council actually began, 4 of the autocephalous churches announced that they would not be attending. And there was a lot of press on what I would call these 4 spoilers. The 4 churches that decided they would announce they would not attend at the 11th hour were the Patriarchate of Moscow, so the Church of Russia, the Church of Georgia, the Church of Bulgaria, and also the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch. Now, on the face of it, there are arguments about why at the 11th hour they decided not to attend. They argued that for 2 reasons. Number one, that there was an outstanding question, a dispute between the Church of Antioch and the Church in Jerusalem over the question of the assignment of a metropolitan to Qatar. That was number one. And number two, there was a more general statement about the lack of consensus, notwithstanding what I said before, that everyone had signed on to these documents, the preparatory documents and the agenda items, the lack of consensus that still ran through those preparatory documents, and therefore a suggestion to postpone the council until these issues could be resolved. Now, interestingly enough, these were issues that had been addressed repeatedly in the lead-up and the preparations to the council. So the real question is, why these spoilers chose then, and what were the consequences of their decision not to attend. Let me say a little bit about that now in the short time that remains to me. The climate of the council itself, was clouded immediately by this decision. What was very interesting about the remaining 10 churches who did attend is that rather than shut the door and turn away, to put it in colloquial terms, what they did is reach out and issue official communiques and make direct contact with the 4 churches who had decided not to come, and to request that they come at the 11th hour, to come at any hour. So that was an interesting exercise from the Orthodox geopolitics perspective, one might say also from the ecclesiastical perspective, of trying to negotiate a solution that wouldn't sabotage the entire council. And from a faith-based perspective, it was also, I think, a real sort of faithfulness to the tradition of the fullness of the ecclesial body. And I thought, the prodigal son story in terms of that response. They did not attend. So the council began on a relatively fragile and clouded note. It quickly moved to become what I found to be a really exciting and impassioned and very candid set of discussions about these 6 agenda items. We read a lot and we hear a lot about the tradition of conciliarity in the Orthodox Church, and conciliarity being based on notions of primacy of honor in terms of who actually can convene the council. That was the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Patriarch of Constantinople. But then a kind of open, level playing field in terms of the way in which these delegations, each delegation of 24 hierarchs and 6 advisors, and I was one of the 6 advisors on the delegation of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, an openness and a kind of candor that I found very exciting and also, quite honestly, somewhat surprising, but also reassuring after the rocky start of the council. There were no punches pulled, again, to use colloquial language. Each of these agenda items, which on the face of it might seem quite pedestrian, ultimately were a window into, again, the church maturing, trying to come to terms with the fact that what emerged as the full Christian church did as an old world church has now moved to become a global church, and what that globalization means also for the local behavior and activism and engagement of the Orthodox Church. And so I would say that 4 particular items or 4 particular takeaways from the agenda and the discussion that I found especially important for thinking about orthodoxy in the global context today, or number 1, a sound condemnation of what was called ethnophilitism, which, again, in political science or policy language would be a condemnation of nationalism and ethno-nationalism. This has been condemned as a heresy by the Orthodox Church since the 19th century, but a round condemnation of that and a foregrounding of faith over other forms of identity. A second important takeaway, a discussion about the church as global church and about the church evolving as a mission church, namely a church operating outside of the old world European context, but participating in, Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in spaces where there are profound human security needs, and how it is that the church's own internal diversity within its unity, what that means in terms of a kind of theology of global engagement, and what one hierarch talked about as a theology of love. Another important takeaway was the recognition of the internal pluralism within Orthodox churches, namely what we would, again, using sort of social science language, what we might talk about as conservative, modernist, traditionalist, everyone has their different terms, but a recognition that within each of these autocephalous churches, there are these kind of competing traditions and ways of interpreting the faith and therefore the way in which these churches engage in the public sphere. This also was connected to, I thought, a very exciting conversation, albeit not, linear, but it emerged over and over again about this aforementioned point about the meaning of consensus. Does consensus imply unanimity or majority? And there were several hierarchs who, were very, very categorical about the need to move from a unanimity principle to a majority principle. One hierarch even used the term, the church, the formulation, the church is a majority, is a democracy. One of the things they talked about was the importance of allowing those who dissented from concluding opinions and the concluding documents to be able to sign but append their dissents. So this itself was, for me, a really interesting window into the kind of internal dynamism that the church, is engaged in and trying to come to terms with. And then finally, the other important takeaway from my perspective was a very robust discussion about issues of ecumenism and interfaith cooperation and interfaith dialogue, and a recognition on the part of the Council that we live in a highly pluralized religious world, which means that the Orthodox Church needs to learn how to engage in that, but in particular in cases where populations are at risk. And, in this case, one of the things that really sort of catalyzed the discussion was the real at-risk condition of Orthodox Christians in the Middle East, as well as other vulnerable faith traditions, but Christians in general, was the need to engage in ecumenical advocacy and cooperation to deliver support, but also in interfaith dialogue in order to expand understanding and move away from kind of zero-sum exclusivist thinking. So that's a quick summation. I think I said at the beginning this was the first time that there was an ecumenical council since the 9th century. I should have said 8th. I'm bad at math. But the other thing I wanted to mention, just as a footnote and a transition maybe, is how it was to be one of the few women in the room. There were only 3 of us on the grand sum of delegations who were part of the official advisors, 3 women. I was the only lay woman as far as I know. The others were nuns. For me, that was a really sort of unique vantage point for kind of thinking about what was going on and witnessing what was going on. I would say that the gender underrepresentation is something that the Orthodox Church needs to do far better on. I would also say at the same time, and I say this as a scholar practitioner who also happens to be Orthodox, I would also say that the inclusion of women, even as I said in an interview I gave somewhere, a thimbleful of us. Nonetheless, it's better that the thimbleful was there in the ocean than not at all. And the inclusion of women was part of a broader discussion about, mining, embracing, and exemplifying the fullness of the ecclesial body. And I would, place this under the broader rubric again of the church coming to terms with, being a global church and a church in the modern or postmodern world. So I'll leave it at that and hope that there's plenty of food for thought for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was wonderful, gives us a lot to chew on, and so I'm sure our callers are now eager to engage you on these issues. So we'll open the lines for questions. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, just press 5*. And when it's your turn to ask your question, our call administrator, Lindy Kunz, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you can ask it. And your line will be placed back on mute immediately following the asking of the question. Note also that if you are already in the queue and for any reason decide you no longer wish to ask your question, you can simply press 5* again and your name will be erased from your queue. And finally, for the sake of all our callers, I'll ask that when you're called upon, please immediately ask your question rather than providing any lengthy commentary. So with that, Lindsay, our first question, please.
Yep, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Elizabeth, for your insights. Your first question today is going to come from Corey Bender. Corey, your line has been unmuted. Please ask your question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, how do you think the absence of the Russian Orthodox Church from the Council shaped the discussion?
I think at the outset, it really cast a pall over the conference, over the Council. But I think as the Council moved forward, the absence, what was less important or less significant. I would place the absence of the Russians in again in a kind of geopolitical context. I would say sort of Orthodox geopolitics and then geopolitics and Orthodoxy. In terms of Orthodox geopolitics or kind of ecclesiastical geopolitics, the absence of the Russian Church was I think recognized by most there, and certainly those who work on the Orthodox Church, as just the latest expression of the Moscow Patriarchate's, the tension between the Moscow-Constantinople axis, and in particular the Moscow Patriarchate's, if not open rejection of, at least constant questioning of the ecclesiastical and ecclesial right of primacy of the Patriarch of Constantinople, that is the right to convene the council. And if you look at I think it's the Fourth Ecumenical Council, Canon 28, it lays it out pretty clearly in there that this, this is a primacy of honor, not a primacy of power. That's, I think, very important to understand sort of how the Orthodox Church functions. The primacy of honor afforded to the Church at Constantinople to convene such councils is quite explicit. The Patriarchate of Moscow has been increasingly disputing that primacy of honor. that's Orthodox, what I would call Orthodox geopolitics, but the geopolitics and orthodoxy piece of that, for me, also helps to understand the rationale for them not coming. And by that I simply mean that although the Patriarchate of Moscow and the Church of Russia is a huge church in terms of its numbers of communicants, and a very wealthy church in terms of its material assets, nonetheless, I think it's a mistake for us to, view that church as fully independent and fully capable of making its own decisions. At the end of the day, it's the Putin government that exercises extraordinary suasion over that church. This is a church that came out of a, half century plus, almost a full century of, embattlement under the Bolsheviks, and so. I think the absence of the church eventually came to be understood by many present as a symptom of a broader problem for churches in general and religion more generally, which is how do churches, effectively achieve independence from, pressure, direct and indirect, from political regimes. So I think it was kind of a learning experience for the Orthodox present to realize that this wasn't just a matter of internal ecclesiastical politicking, that this is, again, part of a religion in the world issue. That's my take on it.
Thank you. Your next question. Sorry, did you want to add any commentary?
Yeah, one other footnote is, the Moscow Patriarchate has issued several statements in the aftermath of the council saying that because the four were absent and because of the size of the Moscow the Church of Russia, that the conclusions of the council this was neither a Pan-Orthodox council nor are its conclusions legitimate for the Orthodox Church writ large. But again, I mean, I would say that the impact of those kinds of statements are they're relatively minimal. They're problematic because they, again, speak to this kind of internal tension. But at the end of the day, those kinds of statements, I don't think in any way really delegitimize the event of the council, and most importantly, the decision of the council to convene another council within 7 to 10 years.
Thank you. Your next question comes from Marina Barnett. Marina, your line has been unmuted, so please ask your question.
Thank you. I also have a question about the Russian Orthodox Church. Considering what you said about the power that current Putin's government has over the strategies and actions of the church, and in the context of current very strained, to say the least, relationship between Russia and pretty much the rest of the world, do you see in the future, you said that there might be another council in 7 to 10 years, do you see that there's a place for the Russian Orthodox Church to play a more constructive role and to be engaged positively? Or do you think the schism will continue and could at the end lead to like a total breakaway of the the Moscow Patriarchate and Russian Orthodox Church from the rest of the Orthodox Church? Thank you.
That's a great question. I think you've sort of laid out the two possibilities. The last one being the more negative one, which is from the the religious perspective, that the issue of schism and breakaway, or the possibility of kind of constructive engagement. I think that I want to be an optimist and think that the Russian Orthodox Church will continue to engage and potentially play a more positive role. One of the things I think is very important in sort of forecasting about which of these two outcomes is looking at what's happening internally in that church. And I think it's very clear that on the face of it, it appears that the Moscow Patriarchate walks in lockstep with the Putin government. On the face of it appears that the church itself operates, with complete support for and unanimity behind the public statements of Patriarch Kirill, when in reality, like any, living, breathing institution, there's a great deal of internal debate and discussion. And I think that's reading the tea leaves really requires us to kind of drill down into who are the competing, actors and factions in the Russian Church and what direction they're going to take things. With regard to that, I think a really important development will be what happens with the church in Ukraine. As the council convened in Crete, the Ukrainian parliament met and voted to support the request of leaders in the Ukrainian church for autocephaly. And again, one of the primacy of honor prerogatives of the Patriarchate of Constantinople is that requests for autocephaly go to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays itself out. And that will have, I think, a very big impact on the willingness of Moscow to engage in a constructive rather than a destructive fashion. I know I didn't really answer your question, but I'm not good at forecasting. I just wanted to kind of lay out some of the variables.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I believe we don't have any other questions in the queue right at the moment, so I'll just encourage our callers who are on the line to press 5-star and engage Elizabeth with any of your thoughts and responses and questions. And in the meantime, I'll use moderator's prerogative and ask my own question, which some of your major takeaways brought to mind one of your most cited articles in the past examined orthodoxy and democracy, prospects for democratization. And so some of the takeaways you mentioned were pointed to factors like a church maturing, a church becoming more global in its identity, a condemnation of ethno-nationalism. So some seeds there, it seems to me, for building towards more robust kind of embrace of democracy and perhaps going even more specifically to liberal democracy. So I was just wondering what your thoughts on that are from this gathering, if there are trend lines pointing more favorably towards democratization and how they intersect with the trend lines going in the opposite direction. And of course, we've been discussing the Russian Orthodox situation, which does seem to be kind of pointed in the opposite direction in recent years. But so I just want your further thoughts on the prospects for democratization.
I would say, Dennis, that I would think about that in two respects. I mean, the council, I think, highlighted this. If we use the term democracy, how the church, how Orthodox churches think about a democracy in terms of their internal operation, and then how they understand democracy as a kind of regime type in a political environment in which churches can operate. And I would say that on both counts, I am optimistic. Sometimes I was sometimes frustrated, but optimistic about what I heard and what I saw. And what I saw was, I would say, a performative speech act of democracy in action, and one might even say liberal democracy in action. As I mentioned earlier, there was a level playing field. Everyone engaged equally, individually, yes, as part of their respective delegations, but everyone was, given an opportunity to have voice. There was by no means, any kind of, I would say, scripting and calibration of the discussion. In fact, like most, democratic engagements, there was a real excitement, unpredictability, and sometimes messiness to the conversation that produced interesting, sometimes surprises. As I mentioned, one of the hierarchs there, saying in terms of this question about what's the meaning of, what do we mean by consensus in the conciliar context, saying the church is a democracy. And so I would say that internally, if one were to take a step back for those who participated, there was what I would characterize as a very democratic ethos in terms of the actual functioning of the council itself. And for that to happen, I would say that, what we saw then was, inputs from churches themselves that some of them function more effectively that way, others don't. Again, in the question of the discussion about the church and its mission in the world, the robust discussion about and questions about how to engage in ecumenical context, a very robust discussion, again, with with disagreements across delegations, but also even within delegations that spoke to the kind of competitive, operational but also ideational features that we associate with democracy. In terms of the church and its external function, and the way the church thinks about democracy in the world and regime type, again, for most of these old world churches, many of them still live in regime spaces that are either explicitly non-democratic or thin democracies or really authoritarian regimes. And the best example of that is the convener, the ecumenical patriarch. The church, the ecumenical patriarchate lives in a hyper-authoritarian, increasingly dictatorial Turkey. The absent church at Antioch living in civil war conditions, but under a regime which is an authoritarian dictatorship, the Al-Assad regime. The Russian absent Russian church, or any of the East European churches who lived under Bolshevik-style governments. These churches, I think, are acutely aware, as are the churches in Africa and Asia, of the importance of democracy, not only for, foundational human rights such as religious freedom, but also for their very survival. And, the open discussion on the importance of interfaith and ecumenical engagement for purposes of the church's ability to perform its, transformative mission, but also to survive. I think, for me, the subtext of that was a recognition that you need, stable democratic regimes in order for the church to do its work well, and where it doesn't, exist under those kinds of regimes, it's the social responsibility and the theological and faith responsibility of churches to stand up to that. And you see that in terms of, the encyclical and the final document in that section in particular, I would say, on religious freedom, the commitment to religious freedom, freedom of conscience, belief in religion. So I would take a glass half full, conclusion from what I saw and heard at the council. I don't mean to sound, Pollyanna-ish by any means, but I think those are important signs in a turn and an understanding by Orthodox churches about how to think about democracy, how to engage in democracy, and how to contribute to democratization.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you much. We had another caller. So Dr. Tonyan from the University of Minnesota. Artyom, your line has been unmuted if you would like to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for the wonderful presentation, and thank you for taking the time to answer questions. I was wondering about the so-called other Orthodox churches, the Oriental Orthodox churches. Were they invited? Were they rejected? Was it even a matter there for discussion? And for the Holy Council to be called Pan, is this problematic at all? Was it even discussed?
Oh, I can answer you as a political scientist rather than a theologian or a religious studies person, but they did not participate in the council, but there were observers who were present in the opening and closing session of the council, and that included some representation from the Oriental Orthodox churches. There was no discussion item per se at the council on this issue. My own perspective is that this is a critical issue for the Orthodox churches, and it's part of their broader discussion about ecumenism. And I think the churches that were present there, if not all of them, certainly some of them, recognize the importance and the urgency of giving a real kind of fullness to the term pan. there's a lot of cooperation on the ground between the Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches at the local level, and my sense is that is going to continue to expand, and as the on-the-ground lived experience of these churches continues, that's going to percolate upward and move the ball forward on the theological side and the ecclesial side.
Thank you. It looks like we had another question come in from Corey. So Corey, go ahead and ask your next question, please.
Hi, Elizabeth. I wanted to follow up to your comment on the Church's attitude toward democracy. He said that stable democratic governments that protect religious freedom will be beneficial to the Church, but it seems like Russia is a fairly prominent exception to this. It seems fairly obvious that a robust religious freedom regime would probably hurt the position of the Church and the Church's own actions. Sorry about that, I'm on the bus. The Church's own actions seem to confirm that understanding. Does that create a disagreement within the Church?
If I understood your question, correctly, just the latter part. First of all, yes, I think there's disagreement within the Orthodox churches about what is democracy. What are the implications of democracy for religion in the world today? How democracy is understood in terms of secularism. Again, as a social scientist, one of the most interesting things for me there was to watch hierarchs and talk about democracy in a way that reflects still this, intrinsic notion that democracy equals secularism, and then to see others push back and argue, that secularism, needn't be understood in its more, I would say, conventional form. So I was heartened by that. But there's a whole array of views, I would say, on how to define democracy. In terms of the Church of Russia and whether or not it's supportive of democracy, I think, its public statements are, very, very disheartening. And I think there's a real struggle within that church about whether indeed they do support democratic politics. If the first part of your question was whether or not democracy would be good for the Church, I think you asked that. I can say that I think many, people in the Church view democracy as something very healthy for the Church because it forces the Church to be able to compete in, a marketplace of ideas. They might not use that language, but that's the reality, in a marketplace of ideas, and gives the opportunity for the Church to make a case and a claim for why its own, views about social transformation and the world in which we live are meaningful. Many moons ago, I did my, epics ago, I did my dissertation work on religion and politics in Greece in the 1980s. And one of the things that was most fascinating about that dissertation research was that efforts to separate, to move away from the establishment model of the church in Greece were actually driven by ecclesiastical actors and lay theologians based on their view that democracy is the best game in town when it comes to the church's ability to really fulfill its own mission in society. And so, I use that example because this is a kind of conversation that's been happening for quite a while, for many decades now in the Orthodox churches, and I anticipate that it will continue to intensify. And certainly for those churches that live in fragile states, and fragile states usually accompanied by authoritarian regimes, I saw explicit recognition of, their understanding of the importance of, rule of law. They may not use the term democracy, but rule of law in particular, and rule of law with equality before the state, ergo democracy, for the church's internal robustness, but also their ability to perform in the public sphere.
Great. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. We are coming towards the end of our call, and I don't think we have any other questions in the queue, so I'll just wrap up with one final question myself, which also has to do with the theme of religious freedom. And I'm just wondering, you have a lot of experience as an advocate yourself for international religious freedom, and so especially given what's been happening in the Middle East in recent years, wondering if the concept of the persecuted church and the heightened awareness in the West and worldwide about the perilous condition of Christians, many of whom, of course, are Orthodox in the region. If you see growing awareness of religious freedom and solidarity, growing ecumenical points of collaboration, specifically on religious freedom issues within Orthodox circles.
Undoubtedly, Dennis. I mean, that was, I think, very clearly, that's a clear takeaway from the council. In terms of the experience and the reality of being a persecuted church, many of the churches there spoke about that explicitly and talked about the threats to their communicants' survival, and so there's great awareness about that. In terms of the discussion of the importance of engaging in ecumenical and interfaith cooperation and dialogue, that was something that was explicitly mentioned as a way to ensure religious freedom rights for Orthodox churches and for all human beings. I mean, there was a direct connection between the notion of image and likeness, all human beings being created in image and likeness of God, with the importance of rule of law, equality before the state, and religious freedom. And that was very heartening to see and hear that. And I think that we see that also in terms of advocacy efforts and activism efforts of the Orthodox churches with, other Christian churches as well as at the interfaith level. And I anticipate that only increasing. So I have no reason to think that, there'll be a U-turn on any of that.
Great. Are there any particular institutions or leaders within the Orthodox world that you would point to as the strongest voices on religious freedom issues?
Well, I think, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has been a consistent, categorical, impassioned supporter and public supporter of religious freedom. Both in terms of, his engagement in ecumenical activities, but also in interfaith activities. And another leader who I think has been equally impassioned and, has had a lifetime of engagement in the public sphere in ways that reinforce religious freedom is Archbishop Anastasios of Albania. So those two in particular, but there were others there as well. For example, the Archbishop of the Church of Cyprus, Chrysostomos, he too made repeated statements about the importance of ecumenical and interfaith engagement and religious freedom. So these are three that I would highlight. The Patriarch of Alexandria as well spoke about the importance of equality and engagement, religious freedom. So these are four, but I would certainly, I guess, foreground the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew and also Archbishop Anastasios of Albania, who also served for many years in Kenya as well. And that's just as a final footnote. I think that was one of the most sort of interesting features of the discussions there, which is that, the churches in what historically might have been called diaspora, and there was a discussion about what that term even means anymore. An interesting discussion that paralleled the discussion in the sociological and the social science and the political science literature about the changing meaning of the term diaspora. So churches in, diaspora, mission churches in Africa and in Asia in particular, but in Africa and post-communist societies as well, talking about the importance of religious freedom. understanding full well that, living in those kinds of fragile, either post-authoritarian or fragile state environments, requires the need to foreground religious freedom.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Our time is up, but it's been a very rich and educational hour. And so thank you again for sharing your expertise. Very timely topic. And I want to thank all of our callers for joining us today as well. And I want to point out as well that our full archive of all the past calls are on, the audio of them is available on our website, which is www.globalengage.org. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all the callers, and thanks for hosting me, Dennis. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.